Hey everyone, thanks for tuning into this session on how you can level up your C++ productivity. I'm Nick Uhlenhut, and I'm a program manager on the Visual Studio C++ team. And I'm actually joined here with Erica Sweet and Augustin Popa, who are going to help moderate the chats as we go along. Basically, how this is going to work is I'm going to do quite a few demos, and we're going to see a video demo as well. And throughout that, you're probably going to have some questions, so definitely write those in the chat. And then at the end of the talk, I'm going to have a bit of time for you to actually, for us to field those questions. And Erica Sweet is going to help join in on those. They're both program managers on the Visual Studio C++ team as well. So that's all the slide work that I want to go into. We're just going to hop straight into the demos. So I've opened up Visual Studio 2019. And this is a CMake project. You can see I've got like a CMake list, CMake settings.json file. And in the Solution Explorer, you'll see that I have this folder structure. So I didn't have to generate a project solution, any sort of like VCX proj to open this in Visual Studio. I was able to open up my CMake project just with this open folder style format. And I can access all my source code here. And obviously click on one of these files, open it up in my editor. But one other sort of tip I want to show you is using Control T. So when you hit Control T, that opens up this navigation pane called Go to All. In the top here, you'll see I can look for a line, a file, recent file. All these buttons are different ways I can filter my search to reduce the search results and make my search faster. So another thing you can do is type a question mark, and that shows you the different letters that correspond with those buttons up at the top. So if I'm looking for a file, I can type F, and then I can start typing my file name, and the search results are only going to show files. So I'll jump into this 2048.cpp file. All right, so in the top of this file, there's a bunch of pound includes. And one thing I want to show is if I take this pound include that's within my ifdef win32 and I move it outside, we get this Clang format dialog, and that's because Visual Studio has detected that I have a Clang format file right here, you can see. And so it's asking if I want to use that formatting. Heck yeah, I do. So I'll click OK. But what I really wanted to show was this purple squiggle that I get now. So I've moved that windows.h out of the ifdef. My active configuration is x64 debug. And I'm getting this purple squiggle. If I hover it, it's saying WSL can't open up my windows.h file. And WSL is the Windows subsystem for Linux. It's running locally on my Windows machine right now. And the reason I'm getting this squiggle is because I actually have a couple other configurations here. So I've specified a few places I want my code to build. I'm doing cross-platform development. So one of those happens to be WSL, and it's letting me know, without me even having to rely on my CI system or anything, it's letting me know if I were to switch into that Linux configuration, that would be an error. So for example, if I actually went and switched into that, we'll see that the squiggle turns red. And also the ifdef text is faded out here because this code chunk is not relevant to my WSL configuration. So how did I add this configuration in here? Well, first let me get rid of that chunk of code since we don't want any problems there. And if I go into Manage Configurations from the dropdown, this leads me to our CMake settings UI. This is just a nice UI over the CMake settings.json file, which you can see is actually highlighted in my Solution Explorer. And if I wanted to edit that JSON directly, you can just click this link in the top right. But I like the UI, so let's stay in here. If I click on x64 debug, these are, again, are the different places where I am building. But if I want to tweak how it's building, that's where the CMake settings comes in handy. So for example, I can edit my tool set, and we actually have support in box for Clang and MSVC. I happen to be using MSVC here. If you're doing some more complicated things, maybe you're doing some cross compilation, or maybe you're using like a custom compiler, something like that. That's where you can specify a path to that toolchain file here. All right, so I've set up my build locations how I want, and I could go ahead and start debugging this project. However, if I do want to, let me choose a target here. This project only has one target, 2048. If I want to customize this debugging a bit, if I just go into the debug menu item here, and then click on debug and launch settings, that's going to pop me into my launch.vs.json. So this is where I can do some more customization to that default debug config. And so in here, we can see the name is already populated to that target that I have up here. And then we actually now also have support not only for this GDB debugger configuration, but if I were to delete that and then click Control Space, which is a hotkey for activating IntelliSense. We can see the 2 completion results here. So we actually also have support for GDB server. In this case, though, I'm sticking with GDB. And you can do a bit more customization here for your debug configuration. You can pass arguments, environment variables, but a really cool thing that we go into more depth into on our main build talk, which I have a link to at the end of this whole presentation, is that you can actually separate your build system from your deployment debug system. And to do that within this, we can start typing. We're getting some nice IntelliSense, but I want to specify that remote machine name for where I want to debug. I actually chose the wrong IP address there. So if I choose this one, this is actually associated with my Linux VM that I have in Azure. And I got nice auto completion for that IP address because I've already established that connection via the remote connection manager. So if I go up into the top search bar, this is where I can get into the connection manager and add my connections. So again, this is now would let me build WSL locally, or build my project targeting WSL, but the deployment and the debugging would all happen in that Linux VM in Azure. So that gives you a lot of flexibility now that you're able to actually separate your build system from your debug system. Cool, so I'll exit out of that. I won't save there because I don't want to do that right now. But one thing that I do want to show is that if you want to add a completely separate debug configuration, you can do that here by just right-clicking on the cmakelist.txt. But let's actually go into cmakelist.txt. And within here, we've made a few improvements in Visual Studio 2019. We actually have language services for CMake and CMake documentation all in the editor now. So like, for example, if I hover CXX standard, I can see documentation here, which helps me understand what I'm dealing with within this file. So in this part that I've commented find package, let's go ahead and include a new package for me to use with this. We can see I'm getting some auto completion here. And this is the auto completion that I really want to show because I think it's super cool. It's actually giving me completion results from VC package, which is our C++ package manager. And so if I want to include glog, for example, it was super easy to do that using that auto completion. VC package is a cross-platform package manager. It's integrated with Visual Studio if you run a command called VC package integrate install. If I hover this, I can actually see some different things I need to do in my cmakelist.txt file in order to include this. So I'm going to go ahead and follow that. And then sort of cheated. I already had this part written out, so all I have to do is uncomment it. And I'm going to switch back into my Windows configuration, and I'll save this file. And now what you'll notice is I actually have a blue squiggle here. So what's going on? I saw auto completion for glog. I thought everything would be good, but now I'm getting this squiggle. Well, I never actually installed it, but Visual Studio is helping me out with this squiggle. And it's saying, hey, this package can be installed with VC package. You don't have it now, but we know that you want this version. You're in your x64 configuration right now. And so this handy little light bulb lets me do that with just one click. I can just click install package using VC package. And now you can see it's actually going to build glog from source, and it's getting the proper version for me. So this x64 Windows. Now, this usually takes me about a minute on my home internet. It might take a bit longer since I'm also doing some broadcasting right now, but we'll see. But in the meantime, I do want to show a couple other tips that I like to do with my instance of Visual Studio. So if I right click on the scroll bar here, and actually let me go into a more interesting file. I'll go into gameboard.cpp. Now, if I right click on the scroll bar, click scroll bar options, I can use map mode, which some people, even on my team, didn't even know about. So I definitely wanted to share it here. And this actually also will show a preview tooltip. So I'll click OK. And now this is a massive file, which we can now truly appreciate with this scroll map. And as I'm scrolling, I can see a preview pane. So this can be handy if maybe I'm doing some editing up at the top of this file, but then I want to reference something later down in this massive file. I don't have to scroll all the way down. I can just hover using this, this cursor in my scroll map. Another thing that you can do when you're dealing with large files, let's say I actually am down in here and I'm referencing maybe this chunk of code. I can actually just click this back button. It's sort of hidden in the top left of Visual Studio, and that'll pop me right back to where I was, and I can go forward and back and just keep jumping between the two. Looks like the installation has finished, so it's letting me know I should regenerate my CMake cache. I'm also getting a gold bar right here, which lets me do that as well. So I'll go ahead and generate the cache. Looks like that's finished. So now if I pop back into my CMake list.txt, that blue squiggle that we used to have for find package is now gone. CMake knows about it now, and we should be able to use this no problem. So let's test that out and try to include something with glog. So I'll start typing. We can see glog appear there. And then when I do the slash, we're even getting auto completion for the different headers within there. So if I wanted to do logging, I can use the logging.h header. Now you will notice there is a purple squiggle. Again, that's the platform specific IntelliSense. And if I hover that, it's letting me know that WSL doesn't actually know about glog. VC package is cross-platform, so I could actually go and copy the VC package command to install it on my Linux instance. I'm not going to do that now, but that's why there is a purple squiggle there. Cool, so I'll jump over into this gameboard.cpp file, and let's say I want to do some logging in here. So maybe before this return statement, let's say, I want to do some logging, build 2020, how about? Well, we're getting red squiggles. So what's up with that? We literally just installed glog. What's going on? Well, if I hover this, log is undefined. Okay, well, we have another handy light bulb here. Let's see what quick action we get. So Visual Studio is actually giving me a quick action to add my missing pound include. I love this feature. I think it's super cool. I just click that one button, the red squiggles are gone, and then up at the top, glog/logging.h, the appropriate header, was added to the top of my file. So we used quick actions to install the package from VC package, and we used the quick action to actually add the proper pound include to the top of my document. Super cool. All right. One last thing about the CMake list.txt. You'll remember to actually use this package, I had to add that line find package. Well, if I wanted to add, let's say I want to add another source file, that means I would also have to edit my CMake list.txt file. So if I go to CMake targets view, which, sorry, I did kind of quick, but you can switch between folder and CMake targets view. So this is a more target centric view. If I right click on this and I add a new item, let's say I want to add a new source file. So I'll just keep the name source CPP, that's fine. Well, once I click add, now Visual Studio in version 2019 is actually giving me a preview of different places where I would need to add this new source.cpp reference in my CMake list.txt file. Now, there's a bunch of different ways that people have their CMake list set up. Seems like there's a million different ways you can do it. So we give you a preview so you can unselect whichever ones that you don't want to apply. But it's a nice handy way for you to actually add another file and make the CMake list editing even easier. Cool. All right. I'm going to switch back into the open folder view. And there's a couple more little tips I want to show before I swing into the next portion of the demo. One is that in Visual Studio 2019, we improved the task list. So down here in the bottom the whole time, I had this task list, and we actually now show you tasks for your entire solution. And so that would be a giant list in here of every single to-do. But what I like to do is actually right-click on description, go to grouping, and I group it by file, because I think this is a nicer way to look at my to-dos for my whole solution. It's all grouped by file, and I can easily navigate to them by just double-clicking on that to-do, and it takes you right there. Cool. And now, final, I promise, tip that I want to give before I head on into the next demo is I talked a bit about in this file about scrolling down to the bottom and scrolling back up, using the scroll map, clicking the back and forth arrows. But one thing that people have asked me multiple times is, how can I just duplicate this tab? Well, you can, a little known secret here is if you click window and then click new window, that actually duplicates your existing tab. And now I can actually just drag this to go side by side. And so now I have a completely independent scroll bar for that file. So I can be referencing one part way further down in the scroll bar and then editing further up. So that's super nifty. And if you actually use this window, new window feature a lot, you can go ahead and assign a shortcut for that from the shortcut options menu. All right, now we're gonna cover Visual Studio's awesome new support for Visual Studio code spaces. And to do that, I'm gonna switch over to a video of that. Okay, I'm going to show you a demo of Visual Studio's awesome new support for Visual Studio Codespaces. Codespaces are managed development environments in the cloud, and you can connect to these codespaces from Visual Studio, VS Code, or even from our editor in the browser. So this greatly expands the devices and places that you can code from. A lot of you, like me, are probably coding from home now, and you may be on a laptop and no longer have all that horsepower of your office machine. However, the beauty of these Visual Studio Codespaces is that your environment is in the cloud, so you can connect from your laptop, but get the power of cloud compute. But I know that seeing is believing, so I think it's time to swing over into a demo, and I'll be connecting to my Codespace using Visual Studio. I've opened up Visual Studio 2019, and this should look familiar to you, except I do have this new tab here to connect to a Codespace. So I'll go ahead and click that, and now it's loading up my plan. This is my billable entity, and I've already created 3 different Codespaces here. If I wanted to add another one, I can just click New, give it a name, point it to a Git repository, choose what sort of cloud compute horsepower I want to have, and then I can choose what sort of suspend time I want once my Codespace goes idle. Then, when you click Create, your code will be cloned and your environment will get configured for you to quickly onboard and get coding. But I've already done this for my fork of OpenCV, so let's go ahead and connect to that environment. All right, so now we're establishing our secure and private connection to our Codespace, and we can see the progress in this pop-up. You'll also notice the familiar UI of Visual Studio 2019. However, since we're connected to a Codespace, my laptop's only responsible for rendering this UI, but all of our other compute is happening in our Codespace. For example, the Solution Explorer population, later when I go run a build, all of that is happening in my Codespace, so it's freeing up my local resources. You'll also see up in this top banner here that we have this cloud icon letting me know that I'm connected to this OpenCV Codespace of mine. Let's go ahead and run a build. But before I build, actually, I just want to reiterate the fact that all the compute-heavy tasks in Visual Studio are running in the Codespace. So when I run this build, my laptop cores won't be affected. You'll notice right now that our CPU usage is around 20% or so. And so let's go ahead and kick off this build. We're building all of OpenCV. And this compute, again, is happening in the Codespace rather than on my local machine. So now that this build has started up, I'll open back up my task manager and we can see how our CPU is looking. So it looks like the CPU is hovering still around 19, 20-ish% right here. So this is showing me that I'm no longer bricking my laptop in order to run this build. Instead, my local compute is freed up so I can do other important tasks. Now this build typically takes around 10 minutes. OpenCV is a pretty large project, so I'll go ahead and skip to the end of this. Okay, now that our build has succeeded, let's go ahead and see what sort of tests have been discovered. I'll open up our test explorer, and it looks like there's around 12,000 tests that have been discovered, but we'll just go ahead and go into this test hierarchy here and navigate to just one of these tests, this conv/0 test. And straight from the test explorer, as you would expect, you can right click and run this test. And you can also double click on a test to take you right to that source code. All right, it looks like our test failed, so let's scroll through this test and see if we can figure out what went wrong. Looks like right here we have expect near, and if I hover over that macro, I can actually see it expanded in Quick Info. But it's taking 2 values and it has some error term here, so it looks like we're checking to see if flops and declared flops are within some margin. If I hover flops, I can see it's of type int64, and declared flops is int, so that could be a problem. So let me go ahead and go to definition on that, and I'll change this to be int64. And then also, when I'm scrolling down here, I want to point out one more thing. You can see we have lp.blobs and we've put weights onto it. And then I'm checking if there's a bias. I then generate that bias, but I don't do anything with it. And so I want to actually push back the bias onto blobs, sort of like I did on line 628. So let me start typing out some code, and I'll hit this dot. And now you'll see that we're actually getting some IntelliCode suggestions here. So IntelliCode is a AI assisted member list for us, and it's letting me know that it thinks I want to use pushback in this context that I'm in. And that's exactly what I do want to use. So let me go ahead and push back that bias. And I want to show that IntelliCode actually is context aware. So if I were to type the same thing, but do it within an if statement, so I type out lp.blobs dot again, now instead of recommending pushback, it's suggesting that I use size. And the reason for this is that it's taking in the context of the fact that I just pushed back something onto blobs and now I'm in an if statement. So it makes sense that I would maybe want to do something like see if the size is now greater than some number, for example. But let's go ahead and remove that extra bit. And with these changes, this test will pass, but instead of running it in the test explorer, let's actually run the exe itself for the associated target. So I'll scroll down, perf dnnd, which is what we have in the test explorer, and let's run this target. And now keep in mind that this debug session is really happening in my code space, so I'm not using my local compute to do this debugging. You'll notice that we've hit our breakpoint and this console is being rendered on my local machine. You can see this cursor sort of following around my cursor, and that's because this console is being app casted from my code space to my local machine during this debugging. So we can see I've hit the breakpoint, and if I go over here, we have our locals window. We can see, for example, that declared flops is now this new type that I've given it. We have our call stack window and the other debugging tooling that you're used to having. So let me go ahead and click continue, and I'll open up that app casted version, and you can see the test has passed. This is that const/0 test, and the console output is letting me know that the test has in fact passed. So now I'll go ahead and stop the debugging. All right, so we saw a bunch of different stuff and a bunch of different demos. Here's a little recap because I know it was a lot. On the left is all the stuff I showed in the first demo. And so we covered a bunch of different things there. A lot of them were around cross-platform development. One thing to call out here again is that second item there, separate build and debug targets. If you actually want to see that in action, definitely watch our on-demand session, which I'll have a link to on the next slide. We also just saw a video on Visual Studio Codespaces, which I'm super excited about. Again, these are managed online environments. They allow you to take the power of the cloud in order to streamline your development. And it also makes onboarding super easy because the configuration happens for you up in the cloud. You don't have to worry about bogging down your machine. And then what I think is the coolest feature of it is the anywhere access. Because you can access your code space from a web browser, you could be in your bed, on your tablet, someone pings you, you can just open up a browser, connect to that online environment, that code space, and get to work, do a quick little fix, and you're on your way. So with all that, here are some super important links. That second link there is where you can actually sign up for a private preview of Visual Studio support for Visual Studio Codespaces. So definitely screenshot this page. It's got a lot of useful links. The first one is just for our Visual Studio preview channel, which I highly recommend signing up for as well. Lastly, the one I want to call out is up in the top right. So that's our on-demand session that I've referenced a couple times. We go into even more depth on some of the things that I showed in this live session. And so if there's some lingering questions maybe you have or some things that we couldn't quite get to, definitely check that session out, and hopefully those questions are answered there. Lastly, down at the bottom is our blog and our Twitter handle. So again, if you have more questions, you can reach out there as well. Cool. So at this point, I think we're going to field any questions that were asked and not already answered in the chat.
All right. So it looks like we have a few questions. The first one is, are all these available in the latest Visual Studio 2019 update?
Yeah, so everything I showed, so here's again this slide. So all of this is in the latest Visual Studio 2019 update. The most cutting edge feature that I showed is actually available in Visual Studio 2019, version 16.7, preview 1. So if you're in that preview channel, you can access that. And that is our first class support for GDB server in addition to GDB. So if you'll remember when I was setting up that debug configuration, doing that customization there, and I showed IntelliSense pop-up, it showed GDB and GDB server. That's a new feature that we have.
All right. Next question is, does CodeSpaces support C++ UI development?
Great question. So right now, CodeSpaces does not support that. We are focused initially on console applications and library development. So that's sort of our first wave of support. And so if you sign up for the private preview, that will be what we're looking for and trying to get feedback on. But your feedback is going to definitely guide what we support next. Obviously, we're taking a waved approach to this.
All right. And then I currently have a project in Visual Studio that uses VCX Proj and on Linux uses CMake files. I really want to move to CMake only without losing the ease of use of Visual Studio, and I wish I could do it without so much effort. So, do we have any feedback or guidance there?
Yeah, so with a CMake project in Visual Studio 2019, I don't know if you've tried that out yet, but you should be able to open up your CMake projects and have a very similar experience to a VCX Proj experience. You can, with CMake, you can do cross-platform development, so you could target Windows and Linux. We have a few other talks where we go into more details about that. I don't know if there's anything else that you want to add there, Erica.
Yeah, I guess that's great feedback. And in terms of migrating Windows specific code bases that are currently using MS Build to using CMake, we don't have any formal guidance or tools to help you there. So that's great feedback for us. And you can feel free to reach out to me on Twitter if you have more to add there. All right, we have one last question from the audience. Um, are you planning to implement a graphic view of class trees like the one we used to have in old IDEs like Code Warrior? So
I don't know of an immediate plan for that. If you haven't given us a feedback suggestion, definitely do that. We do look at those all the time. So that third link on this slide, the developer community, look to see if someone has already put that in there, and then you can upvote it. If not, just add it in there yourself, and we monitor that all the time. But that's a great suggestion.
all right. And then I guess lastly, a question from me. This for the audience. So this demo was a lot about our tooling for cross-platform development and for code spaces. But if I'm interested in updates on standards conformance or the MSVC toolset or C++ CLI, what can I do? Is there any content for me?
Yeah, so all of that content should be in the on-demand session. It's actually at the start of that talk. So if you click on that link that I have in the top right of the slide and you watch the first, I think like 10 or 15 minutes, it's going to cover all that. It'll cover conformance. It'll cover our STL, which is now open source. It covers some of that. It'll cover things like our build throughput improvements, linker improvements, all of that type of stuff is covered in our on-demand session.
Awesome, thanks. So yeah, that's it for the question session and for this live Q&A for you. So
Awesome.
thanks, Nick.
Yeah. Thank you all so much for tuning in.